66b, and we are at right. About 2/3 the way down, about eight lines up from the medium lines. We're at Uben Grusha, Uben Chalutza, the Avedosik Shera Minalan. First one line is Grusha. Got it?
Sure.
A couple probably a few paragraphs before the Mishnah.
Of a mitzvah is of the mitzvah.
Yeah, a little probably the next one.
Yeah.
You're probably looking at the other side of the page.
Okay, so the divorcee, the son of a chalutza.
Or the next side.
Oh,
it's probably somewhere there.
Okay. Does the Gomorrah ask regarding a blemished kohen? Are we before the Mishnah?
Before the Mishnah, but not much, just a couple of lines.
Oh, okay. So we're
okay. So yesterday we basically pointed out that if the son of a grusha performs a sacrifice, and during the performance it was discovered that he's a ben grusha ben chalutza, what he's done is kosher. Unlike if it was discovered that he had a blemish, where what he's done is non-kosher. If he brought a sacrifice, the owner would have to bring a new sacrifice again, because the sacrifice he brought was not kosher. Obviously, depending slightly on the circumstance, but generally speaking, he would have to bring another sacrifice. So how do we know? How do we know that? How do we know that that the son of a grusha, the son of a divorcee, his service is kosher? Amar Yehudah, Amar Shmuel. So Yehudah says the name of Shmuel. The Amar Kra, the verse states, "V'hoisa loy ulazari achrav." The law of a kohen is to him and his children after him. The word zara is plural, meaning whether that child is ben zera kosher or ben zera apostle. We treat as a kohen the son of a kohen, even if his son is not a kosher kohen. What does that mean? Obviously, if you know his son's not a kosher kohen, you don't treat him like a kosher kohen. But if you don't know, then he's treated his service is kosher. Avoid Shmuel Amar, the son of Shmuel, the father of Shmuel, says another source. Mehacha Baruch Hashem Chelai Upoyel Yodav Tirza. The God desires the work of his, let me say this. Literally speaking, what it means is Baruch Hashem Chelai. God will bless his, soldiers, the group. Upal Yodav Tirza, and it desires the handiwork. But the way the father of Shmuel reads it is afilu chulan shabai tirza. Even though it's possible that the son of a kohen is not a kosher kohen, and therefore the sacrifice is still chulan, it's not an appropriate sacrifice, God still desires it. In other words, you fulfill the obligation to bring a sacrifice. Rabbi Yanai says, Mehacha from here, Ubasa el hakohen asher yeh bayom hahem. This is I believe with regard to Bikurim, you come to the kohen that's around in your time. So what exactly does that mean? Is it possible for you to go to a kohen who's passed on 20 years ago? Obviously not. So what does that mean? If he was considered a kohen at that time, it was unknown that he was a chal, so then his service is kosher. So those are three sources that indicate that the service of the son of a divorcee before it's known is kosher. What about on the other side? And how do we know that if somebody has a blemish, his service is not kosher? Amar Yehudah, Amar Shmuel, Amar Kra. The verse states, "L'chein emar hinni noitzim le'isbrisi shalom." This is where God takes Pinchas and turns him into a kohen. That's because Pinchas kills Zimri. So God gives him the covenant of peace. Okay. And it means that he made him a kain. Okay, but what does it mean? The way the Gemara is interpreting it here is kishu shalom v'loy kishu chaser. The covenant of a kain, shalom means peace, but if you pull out the vav, what it means is shalom means complete. V'loy kishu chaser, but not if he has a blemish, he's incomplete. V'ha shalom siv, but it says shalom with a vav, meaning peace, not complete. Amar Rav Nachman vav the shalom kitiyahu. How do they explain that?
Whether it appears in the word shalom is severed.
It's a small vav. It's a small vav. Yeah. So therefore, it can be under.
Yeah, a small.
Yeah.
There's a small blank space interrupting the stem of the letter.
Yeah. So because that vav is small, so we can read it as if the vav isn't there. Okay. Okay, now we get to the fun territory. Okay, just give me a second here. Okay, let's start. So the Mishnah here basically has three general rules, and then the Mishnah explains the general rules. So here's the three general rules first. Anytime there is Kiddushin, and there's no sin. Okay, any marriage that has Kiddushin, ve'ein avera, there's no sin. Or anytime there is Kiddushin and there is a sin. It's the second category. And the third category is there is no Kiddushin, but this is a woman who would have otherwise had Kiddushin. For example, if you marry your sister, you can't marry your sister. It doesn't exist. There's no such thing. If you try to give Kiddushin, there is no Kiddushin. But your sister can get married to whoever she wants.
Right.
That's the third general rule. Okay, and the fourth rule is somebody who doesn't have Kiddushin and doesn't have Kiddushin for anybody. For example, a Jew can't marry a non-Jew. There is no halachic framework for that to take place. There is no Kiddushin. They can live together. There's no marriage. Not only is there no marriage to that specific Jew, there's no marriage to any Jew. Those are the four general rules. So now the Mishnah will explain each one. Okay, let's see the Mishnah. Kol makom sheyesh Kiddushin ve'ein avera. Any scenario that has Kiddushin, but there's no sin. This is basically what you would think of a normal, regular marriage. What's the law? Havlad hoilach achar hazochar. The child, in determining the child's yichus, his family status, you go based on the male. Okay, in other words, if somebody's father is a kayan, he's a kayan. Somebody's father is from Shevet Binyamin, he's from Shevet Binyamin. Ve'ezu, what's an example of this? Zu kohenes levia v'Yisraelis. You have a kayan Levi or Yisraelis, females. Shenosu, they got married to males, kayan Levi v'Yisrael. You go based on the male. If the male is a Levi, the children are Levium. Next rule. The kol makom sheyesh Kiddushin v'yesh avera. Let's say there is Kiddushin, but there's also a sin. We'll give examples in a moment. Havlad hoilach achar hapogam. The child goes based on the how do you say pogam in English? How do they translate pogam? The one with the defect.
Blemish.
The blemish party. Okay, the party that so we'll give examples in a moment. Ve'ezu. What's an example? Ve'ezu zu almana l'kohen gadol. An example of this is a widow to a kohen gadol. So the widow, but to a kohen gadol is a forbidden relationship. The woman, because she violates a forbidden relationship, gets the halachic status of what we call a zayna, and therefore the children are chalolim. Now, that's even though the father is a kohen, the child is a chol. Or the same thing as grush v'chalutz l'kohen headed, or mamzeres unesin liyisrael.
How do you describe a chol? Sort of like a kohen without the.
He's a child of Aaron. He's a descendant of Aaron, but he's not a kohen. I know people that are chol. Yeah, it's not so. There are plenty of unfortunately today. It's not hard to figure out how it happens. Anyway, yeah. Okay. Anyway, so you have a mamzer and an osin. A nosin, what exactly? A nosin is a separate discussion. Similar status to a mamzer. A mamzeres marries a Yisrael. That is prohibited. A Yisrael is not allowed to marry a mamzeres. If he does, what happens? The child is halach achar hapogam, right? The child, even though the male is a kosher male, because the female is a mamzer, the child is a mamzer as well. And the same is true the opposite way. If a Jewish female, kosher female, marries a mamzer or a nosen, a male mamzer or nosen, the child is a mamzer or nosen. Okay, that is the second rule. The kolmish ein lo olav kiddushin. Somebody who does not have kiddushin. A classic example of this is a sister, right, or a mother or a daughter, etc. However, aval yesh lo alacherim kiddushin, but other people can marry them. The story is havlad mamzer. The child of that relationship would be a mamzer. So in other words, if somebody marries his sister or his mother or his daughter, etc., these are people that do have kiddushin. Somebody else can marry them, but to him they're forbidden. The child is a mamzer. What's an example of this? Any one of the 16 ervos in the Torah could be who marries if a man marries any of the 16 ervos, then his children will be mamzerim. The kolmi she'ein lo loy olav v'loy alacherim kiddushin. If somebody does not have, if a man marries a woman that does not have kiddushin, period, not to him, not to anybody else, v'loy alacherim kiddushin, havlad kamaisa, the child goes based by the child is determined based on the status of the woman. For example, and is that what's an example of this? Zevlat shifcha v'nachras. So if a Jewish man marries a non-Jewish woman, the halachic status of the child is based on the woman, right? And that would mean the child is not. Repeat, please. If a Jewish male marries a non-Jewish woman, that is a woman who does not have kiddushin, right, neither to him nor to any other Jews. The child's halachic determination is based on the female, which means in that case the female is a non-Jew, child would be non-Jewish. And same is true if the woman in question was a indentured maidservant.
Kiddushin
means halachic marriage, and that would be in this context. The nisuin is not even important; it's just kiddushin. That the condition really in scenarios of determining erva, virtually the only, I believe in virtually every scenario, the determining factor is kiddushin, not nisuin. Nisuin is in terms of if you want to live a kosher life, you're expected to do kiddushin and then to consummate the relationship with nisuin. In terms of determining halachic status of marriage, it's all kiddushin. Okay, so quick review. There's 4 scenarios, right? Okay. What's the first one? Regular. There is kiddushin and there is no avera. That's hopefully every marriage, right? Every regular marriage, there is kiddushin, married woman, and there's no avera. There's no sin. The second category is where there is kiddushin, but there is also a sin. What's an example of that? A kohen marries a woman forbidden to him, right? Either it's a grusha chalutza or an alma or a chalala. Or if you have a Yisrael who marries a woman that's forbidden. For example, he marries a mamzer. Mamzeros, a female mamzer. In that scenario, the child goes based on the blemish of either one. So we don't say that in the first scenario there's no regular marriage. That the child's halachic status is determined by the father, whether he's a Kayin, a Levi, or Yisrael, which tribe he's from. In terms of in the second scenario, it goes by either parent, whichever one is more blemished, that's the blemish that he gets. Okay. The third scenario is where there is no Kiddushin, but this is a woman that's otherwise eligible for Kiddushin. And that is typically what is called an erva. Relative. I believe there are 16 ervas. I believe there are shlosh esrei nashim, but there are another 3 that are not relevant to. I believe there are 16 ervas. Okay. And finally, someone who's not eligible for Kiddushin because they're not an eligible candidate, period. That would be a Jew, a non-Jew, or a maidservant where the child goes based on the female. The child's status is determined on the, by looking at the female. Okay. Says the Gemara. Okay, now the first point of the Gemara is going to try to bring a bunch of exceptions that aren't listed in the Mishnah. So examples where there might be Kiddushin, but the child would go based. There's Kiddushin and there's no sin, but the child still is determined by the mother. A few exceptions. That basically will take us through the middle of Samach Zayin and Beis. Okay, so let's see. Is this a general rule that whenever Kiddushin exists but there's no sin, the child is determined by the father? Hold on, we have an exception to this. The Hare, top of Samach Zayin and Beis 67a. Ger shenosam mamzeres. You have a convert who marries a mamzeres, a female mamzer. The yesh kedushin ve'en avera. A convert is allowed to marry a mamzer. So there's no sin. There is kedushin, there's no sin.
And why is there no sin here versus another scenario where
a Jew is not allowed? A
born Jewish marries a mamzer, but there's a problem.
Born Jewish is not allowed to marry a mamzer. Convert is allowed to marry a mamzer.
Okay, if a born Jew marries a mamzer and there's a kid, the kid is considered
born Jewish marries a mamzer, the child is a mamzer. Vlad halach achar apogam.
Mamzer still a Jew?
A mamzer, of course.
Okay, just check. All right.
Yeah. Okay. So now we have a legal marriage, no sin, and yet Havlad halach achar apogam. The child is still a mamzer. Why don't we say the child goes based on the male, and therefore the child should not be a mamzer? Right? We have a convert Jewish male who is permitted to marry a mamzer and does so, marry mamzeres, and he has a child. That child is still a mamzer. Why? Why is it following the mother? It's a legal marriage. There is Kiddushin. Should go by the father. No sin. Legal marriage, no sin. So it should go by the father. Why is it determined by the mother? The Tanya we learned, Ger shenosam mamzeres, if a convert marries a mamzeres, which by the way is a legal marriage and there's no sin in it, Havlad mamzer, the child is a mamzer. Divrei Rabbi Yossi, it's the opinion of Rabbi Yossi. Amar lei. So Rabbi Yochanan responds, Mi sabras masnisin Rabbi Yossi. Do you think the mission is Rabbi Yossi? Masnisin Rabbi Yehudah. The mission is Rabbi Yehudah. What's Rabbi Yehudah's opinion? The Amar Rabbi Yehudah says, Ger lo yisam mamzeres. And therefore, v'yesh kedushin, v'yesh avera. Rabbi Yehudah says it is a sin for a convert to marry a mamzeres. So therefore, if there's kedushin but there is a sin, what's the halacha? Follow the blemish. So therefore, the fact that the child is a mamzer determined by the mother makes sense. Okay. Okay. V'nitznaya. Okay, if that's the case, why doesn't the Mishnah include it as an example? The Mishnah's example of yesh kedushin v'yesh avera, legal with us. There is kedushin, but there is a sin. What are the examples the Mishnah gives? A kayan's forbidden relationships, and Yisrael marrying a mamzer. Why don't we have another example of a convert marrying a mamzer? So the Gemara says, Tana kol makom b'sefer la'asuye. The Mishnah gives it as a general rule, and that includes it in the general rule. As the Mishnah doesn't give every single scenario, that's why the Mishnah gives a general rule. The ve'ezuzu are only examples. Or alternatively, we can say, la'olam Rabbi Yossi. It's the opinion of Rabbi Yossi, and it's a legal marriage. The Tana ezuzu lemiute ve'ez lemiute. Okay, So the Mishnah could really be going like Rabbi Yossi. What does Rabbi Yossi say? Yesh Kiddushin ve'ein avera. Perfectly legitimate marriage. Yet the child is a mamzer.
Just seems strange. It's a legitimate marriage. You can have a mamzer.
Yeah. Well, now that seems to be an exception to the rule.
Yeah.
The answer is true. The Mishnah gives examples, tell you that there are exceptions. The Eizazu tells me that there are exceptions to the rule, and this is an example of an exception. Okay, hold on 1 second. So the Gemara says, "Ve'ezazu v'sulay." You mean to say that the examples listed in the Mishnah are to tell you that there are exceptions? Because, in other words, these are the main examples, but there are some exceptions that don't follow the rule. So do you mean to say that I have other examples? Chol shenasa bas Yisrael. You have a cholol, non-kosher kayan, marries a Jewish woman. The yesh kiddushin ve'ein avera. There's kiddushin, there's no sin, legitimate marriage. Havlad halach achar zacha. The child goes based on the father, and therefore is a cholol. He's a non-kosher child of Aaron. Now, that example is not listed in the Mishnah. When the Mishnah says it's examples of kosher kahanim, kosher marriages, the Mishnah says Kayan Levi Yisrael that marries Kayan Levi Yisrael. Well, what about a chol? Not listed. So Gemara says, you're right. Holei kasha, our Mishnah is not difficult. Kirav Distoi ben Rabbi Yehudah. Our Mishnah goes according to the opinion of Rabbi Distoi, Sviralite, and Rabbi Distoi says that if a chol marries a kosher Jewish woman, the children are kosher. They're allowed to marry kahanim. So you have a chol, a kosher marriage. Chol marries a Yisraelis. They have a daughter.
Mm-hmm.
Now, under regular circumstances, we would say that daughter is determined by her father. Therefore, she's a chalola. She's not eligible to marry a kain. Says Rav Distoi, no. If a chol marries a bas Yisrael, then the child is eligible to marry a kain. That child is not a chalola. She's a child of Aaron, but she's neither a kain nor an invalid kain. She's nothing. And she's allowed to marry a kain. So if that's the case, that's an exception to the Mishnah, and that's why the Mishnah doesn't list it. Okay, fine. You have a scenario of a Yisrael who marries a female that is a chalola, right? Invalid kohenet. She's a chalola. The yesh kiddushin ve'en avera. There is kiddushin and there's no sin. Permitted marriage. It's legitimate marriage. What's the story? Havlad halach achar zochar. The child is determined by the father, meaning the child is kosher, and that is not listed in the Mishnah. The Mishnah says Kahan Levim Yisrael marry Kahan Levi Yisrael. What about a chol, a Yisrael who marries a chalola, where the children are perfectly kosher? That's not listed. So Gemara says you're right. Tana kol makam derechel asuye. When the Mishnah makes a general rule, the general rule is inclusive. It includes some that aren't listed. So, in other words, so far what we have in the Gemara basically is that there's a general rule that includes stuff that isn't listed, and then there are examples given to exclude stuff that's exceptions to the rule. So the Mishnah is not exactly hard and fast, right? The Mishnah is giving you general rules, but there are exceptions, and there are exceptions, and there are things that aren't listed. Yeah, this never happens. Okay.
Hi.
So the Gemara says, "V'nisnaya behedya." Why doesn't the Mishnah spell it out? Why can't the Mishnah say also an example of a Yisrael marrying a chalola? So the Gemara says, "Mishun delay masnila." It can't say because it doesn't flow well. Hechinisni. Because what does the Mishnah say? Kehenes levius v'Yisraelis v'chalola shenotza l'kayin levi v'Yisrael. That wouldn't work, right?
Mm-hmm.
It'd have to be listed as its own category of marriage. Because the Mishnah basically says Kayin Levi Yisrael marries Kayin Levi Yisrael. Now that makes sense. That's kosher. But Kayin Levi Yisrael chalola that marries Kayin Levi Yisrael, no, Kayin can't marry chalola. So therefore, it didn't fit, and that's why it's not. That's why it's not listed. Shows the Kayin Levi Yisrael chalola, the Kayin Michazia, but okay, so that wouldn't work. So the Gemara says Va'ika de Rabba Barchana. We have the exception of Rabbi Bar Chana. The Omer Rabbi Bar Chana, Omer of Yechanan. Rabbi Bar Chana says the name of Yechanan. Mitzri Sheni Shenosa Mitzris Rishona. Okay, so what's the law of a Mitzri? You're familiar with this law? The laws of an Egyptian.
Well, was it the third generation?
Third generation.
After the third generation, they
Very
get
good.
married and their kids are included in Kol Yisrael.
Correct. Right. Now, once we're discussing that, we might as well go to the next category, which will come up in a moment. In terms of nations that convert, right? There's 3 forbidden nations, right? And they are
The Ammonites,
goods,
and Moabites.
goods, and the Egyptians.
Well,
Yeah.
in Egypt.
Now, Ammon and Moab have an interesting feature. What's that feature?
They're they out for
Females.
good.
There we are. The females. The females are permitted. The males are forbidden. The females are permitted. With regard to Egyptians, it doesn't make a difference, but they are permitted after 3 generations. Okay.
After 3 as in before, but at the 3rd.
Dar Shlishi Avayohen. Dar Shlishi Avayohen, I believe is possible. Yeah. Okay. Rabbi Chana says the name of Rabbi Yechanan. Here's a scenario. Mitzri Sheni, 2nd generation Mitzri. Shenasa Mitzris Rishona. They marries the 1st generation Mitzris. So the male here is the 2nd generation. The female's 1st generation. But now the child is Shlishi, the 3rd generation. Yeah, and Rashi, yeah. Dar Shlishi Yavilam.
Then he's permitted.
And he's permitted to marry it. Okay. The child, okay, and this is a perfect example. This is a legitimate marriage, right? It's perfect. There's Kiddushin, there's no sin in it. A Mitzri is allowed to marry another, a Mitzri convert is allowed to marry another Mitzri convert. And they get around, she skips a generation. Why? Because it goes by the father. The father is a Mitzri Sheni, the mother is a Mitzri Rishon, Mitzris Rishona, and therefore the child is a 3rd generation. Goes by the father. Father's 2nd, he's 3rd. This is an example of Havlat Halach Achar Zachar. It's not listed in the Mishnah. So the Gemara says, you're right, it's not listed. When the Mishnah says, as a general rule, it includes this scenario as well. Okay. According to Rav Dimi, that says the child is a Sheni, so this is an exception to the rule. Right? This is an example of Yesh Kiddushin ve'ein Avera, and the child goes by the mother, not by the father. Right? And according to Rav Dimi, the child here is a 2nd generation Mitzri, but based on the mother, not based on the father. The father would make him a 3rd generation. So this is an exception. So the Gemara says, yeah, it's an exception. And Tana Ezazu Lami'ute. Then it's excluded by the examples the Mishnah is given. Okay, so the Gemara says, okay, we have the exception of Ravin. Ravin says the name of Rabbi Yechanan. We'll explain this, hopefully today in a little bit. Basically, okay, let's say you have a male Amini and the opposite. You have a male Mitzri and a female Amini. Right? The child is a Mitzri if they're both non-Jewish. Child is a Mitzri, and they go by the father. Now, let's say they convert. Okay, now if the child is a female, we give her the stringencies of her. We tell her that she's like her father. She's Mitzri. She has to wait 3 generations. If the child is a male, we say you go by your mother and you're a Amini and you can never marry it. You see? Okay. Now, this if they convert a Mitzri convert is allowed to marry an Amoni convert. It's Yesh Kiddushin ve'ein Avera. And if that's the case, then we should go always by the father. This is an exception to the rule. So Gemara says, you're right. Tana ezu lemiutin. That's why the Mishnah gives examples to exclude this scenario. Okay. Now the Gemara has an interesting observation, which basically sums up everything we just said. Okay, hi mai. So now remember like this. We have the first two rules in the Mishnah. First rule is yesh kedushin ve'ein avera. What's the rule? What happens in that scenario? The child goes determined by the father. Yesh kedushin ve'yesh avera. What happens? Child is determined by the pogum, the blemish.
The blemish.
Okay. So now let's go as follows. Let's say we say the Mishnah is Rabbi Yehudah. What does Rabbi Yehudah say? That a convert is not allowed to marry a mamzer. So let's explain the Mishnah. Kol makam dereisha, the general statement of the beginning of the Mishnah. Yesh kedushin ve'ein avera, legitimate marriage. That includes a Yisrael who marries a chalala, right, a woman who's the child of Aaron but not qualified to marry Kain. Okay, so that's included by the first category of the Mishnah. 1 second, hold on. And it also includes Rabbi Barachana, right, which is a Mitzri Sheni that marries a Mitzri Rishon, Mitzri Rishona, where the child is a third generation and is permitted to get married. That's included as well. Ezuzu, what's the limitation? Lemiute diravdimi v'Ravin. The limitation is to exclude Ravin. Ravin disagrees with Rabbi Barachana. So Ravin would say that a Mitzri Sheni that marries a Mitzri Rishona, the child is a Sheni, is a second generation, not a third generation. 1 second. That's Rav Dimi, and Ravin is we are. An Amoni marries we're an Amoni marries we're a Mitzri marries an Amonis that the child goes based on the blemish. That's excluded by the second rule because that's a legitimate marriage, but it does not we don't follow the father. Okay. Kol makom de seifa, a legal marriage, the Kiddushin, a valid marriage, but it's not legitimate. So that includes Lasuya Gerushinos and Mamzeros. So according to Rabbi Yehudah, that includes a convert that marries a Mamzeros, which is an illegal marriage, right? It's not a legitimate marriage, and it's included as an example of where the child goes based on the blemish of either one, which would make the child a Mamzeros. But if you say we're going according to the Rabbi Yossi, that a ger marrying a mamzer is a legitimate marriage, so then it's excluded right? So then it's excluded under the examples given in the first general statements. The first statement was there's Kiddushin, but there's no sin, perfectly legitimate marriage. That is the marriage of a ger to a mamzeres, but that's an exception to the rule, because when a ger marries a mamzeres, the child is still a mamzer. So kol makom dereisha kedamaron, ezuzu kedamaron, al kol makom deseifa lasuyei mai. The conclusion, the second general category, which is a category the second category there is Kiddushin, but there's also a sin. It doesn't include anything. Because he holds that the marriage of a convert to a mamzer is legitimate. So Gemara says, according to your argument, Rav Yehudah ezu the seifa lamali. According to Rabbi Yehudah, the Mishnah and the Seifa, meaning yesh Kiddushin v'yesh avera, so there's Kiddushin plus a sin. The Mishnah gives examples. What are those examples? What are those examples coming to exclude? Nothing. There's no exceptions to those. So what are you going to have to respond? The second general rule of the Mishnah is frameworked in the same as the first. It's given as a general statement with examples. Well, if that's the case, then there's no question of Rav Yossi either. According to Rav Yossi, what's the expansive statement of the general statement of the second part of the Mishnah? The answer is there's no meaning to it. It's just the same framework as the first part of the Mishnah. Together? Okay. Well, if that's the case, we can move backward a little bit. Gufa.
If it's complicated enough, we're gonna throw in a chart, and here they finally doing.
Very good. Very good. Okay, Jules said the article has a chart that might be helpful. Okay, Gufa. Now going backward a little bit, we'll see this and we'll stop. Kiyasa Ravin Rabbi Yechanan. Ravin said the name Rabbi Yechanan, but Umais if they're non-Jews, you go by the male. This guy, if they convert, you go based on the blemish. My boom is what is an example of this? Keditanya we learned. You have a non-Jew from China who goes ahead and marries a Canaanist, and the child is considered a Chinese and not considered a Canaani. What's the difference? Male Canaanites are killed. God told us not to take slaves from the Canaanite nations. That's the nation of Canaan, but the nations of other Canaanite nations as well, whether they were the Chivi or Yevusi. Okay. Talmud Leimer, how do we know this? There are outsiders that sort of live with you. You can buy from them slaves. Let's say a Canaani went ahead and married a Chinese woman. That you can buy the child we should also treat the child as Chinese and not as a Canaani. Those born in your territory and not those that live in your territory. Okay, meaning that if the child that if the woman here in this case is a if the woman in this case is because the male in this case is someone who lives in your territory, meaning if the male is a Canaani, so therefore they're excluded, and the child is considered a Canaani. Okay, Niskairu, if they convert, Holach Achar Pogam Shabashneim. We'll stop there. Okay. Have a great day.